Welcome back. Welcome back. Thank you guys for hitting the link. Thank you guys for joining the live. Once again, you are watching Matthew Daniels TV. Give me just a second to make sure my audio is good, and just a second to get my PowerPoint together. And we're going to get off into this information. I know you guys can see the title of this one, so you already kind of know what we're going to be talking about. And I promise you, this one is definitely going to be a good one. It's definitely going to be a good one. We're actually living in an amazing time, and honestly, it's only going to get better from here, right? It's only going to get better from here. But we're living in a time where, and honestly, we're living in a time where we got our first comment. Lauren Mathis says, good morning, good morning, good morning. Good to see you in the building. Good to see you in the building. How everything going? I hope everything is well. Hope your day's going good, and I hope your week goes good as well. So we're actually living in a time period in which we are far enough removed from the institution of slavery that archaeologists can do archaeological digs on the plantations where our ancestors were enslaved. They're actually digging underground beneath the plantation homes. They're digging under the ground beneath the quote unquote slave quarters where our ancestors lived. They're excavating the wooded areas and the lakes and streams, and just all of the various geological features that surrounded these plantations while our ancestors were enslaved, and they are beginning to uncover evidence of the stories that we've all heard. Now, I for one think this is amazing because I love history, I love archaeology, I love doing research, and oftentimes we hear about archaeological research being done on things that they are finding from 5,000 years ago in Egypt, or they're uncovering things that were covered under the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, or they're telling us something that the ancient Greek people did, and they're finding evidence of the ancient Greek cultures, or they found something in Britain, they found something in France, they found something in Italy. Okay, or they found evidence of modern man all the way in Ethiopia. And I, for one, love these archaeological findings, right? I love seeing it. I love the information. I love the history. But I don't feel personally and directly connected to the stories that these archaeological finds represent. But now, with these new excavations being done in reference to slavery in the Americas, I feel a direct connection because it is archaeological evidence that is piecing together the stories of my and your ancestors who went through one of the most horrendous tragedies known to mankind. We have another comment. 201 Mo says, the real bookworm preach king. Peace. Peace to you as well. Thank you for tapping in. Thank you for tapping in. I hope all is well. I hope your week is starting off great. I hope your week continues to go great. And I hope that everything you want in life comes to you. Let's put this positive energy out into the universe. So what we're going to be talking about today, I'm going to be bringing to you guys one specific piece of archaeological evidence that I've come across doing my research that I think is really, really interesting. Now, this video is called Archaeological Evidence of Hoodoo, Robert E. Lee Memorial, Arlington House. So you can already get some kind of a general understanding of where I'm going to be going with this. I've been telling you guys a lot of stories about hoodoo. I've been sharing with you stories of what our ancestors had to say about hoodoo. Now I'm going to show you some of the archaeological evidence that our ancestors practiced hoodoo, and how they were able to do it. Now, moving forward, we have to understand that we're talking about an enslaved people, so their access to material possessions was extremely limited. Okay, they weren't able to buy the things that they wanted. They weren't able to create the things that they wanted, so they had to utilize the things that were available to them and use them in a manner that suited their ultimate needs. And we're going to see that even at such a late date, we're talking about during the time and immediately leading up to the Civil War, we're going to see archaeological evidence of our ancestors using hoodoo on the slave plantations and how they used it. And we're going to be conceptualizing what that meant to them. So this is archaeological evidence of hoodoo, Robert E. Lee Memorial, Arlington House. So let's get right into it, family. Now, what you're seeing on your screen, this is the Robert E. Lee Memorial. Okay, this is what they're calling the Arlington House. Now, the Arlington House is the nation's memorial to Robert E. Lee. It honors him for specific reasons, including his role in promoting peace and reunion after the Civil War. In a larger sense, it exists as a place of study and contemplation of the meaning of some of the most difficult aspects of American history: military service, sacrifice, citizenship, duty, loyalty, slavery, and freedom. Now, for those of you who do not know, Robert E. Lee was the commander of the Confederate Army. When they talk about the Confederates surrendering, they're talking about Robert E. Lee surrendering to the Union forces. Now, some historians argue that ideologically, Robert E. Lee was against slavery as an institution, because he more or less felt that white people owning slaves made white people worse off because it degraded them morally. However, he owned slaves, okay? And he owned slaves at the location that you're seeing on your screen, this Arlington House. Now, I'm not saying that the slaves lived inside of that building. Of course not. But when you think about a plantation, you always have to think about the major structure, the quote unquote big house, okay? The major landmark on an area that sits on multiple acres. Now, the slaves would have quarters around this quote unquote big house out on the acres of land that the plantation houses. So we're not saying that all of the slaves lived inside of this house, of course not, but the House represents the plantation where the slaves were held in bondage. Now, when we're talking about and we're going to get into this, and I'm going to show you guys some of the sources, and we're going to talk about what those sources mean. But the slaves that Robert E. Lee owned at the quote unquote Arlington House, he inherited them from an ancestor of his wife. Okay, now his wife was a Custis. The Custis family was a powerfully rich family that goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War. If you remember, the first president of the United States was a man by the name of George Washington. George Washington had a wife named Martha. Martha was actually a Custis. Okay, Martha was actually a Custis, and her family was already well-to-do and rich and slave owners before she married George Washington. So Robert E. Lee's, the woman that he married, was also a Custis, and she was a descendant of George Washington's wife. And in some sense, she was a descendant of George Washington as well, a step descendant, because George Washington, he never had any children of his own, but he married a woman who had children from a previous marriage, and he raised those children as if they were his. So George Washington never had any physical descendants, but his wife's children that he raised and their children are intimately tied to George Washington through marriage. So let's get into it, and we're going to break down some of that stuff, and we're going to break down what they found at this Arlington quote unquote Arlington house. Now, I just gave you guys some light information about Robert E. Lee, but we can see here they say that Robert Edward Lee, the E stands for Edward, was a Confederate general during the American Civil War, towards the end of which he was appointed the overall commander of the Confederate States Army. He led the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederacy's most powerful army, from 1862 until its surrender in 1865, earning a reputation as a skilled tactician. Now, even though Robert E. Lee and the Confederates eventually surrendered, Robert E. Lee, he's still, and you know he was a Confederate, he's still held up high in the context of American history. They always talk good about this guy whenever you hear them talk about him. So you see, they go on to tell us that Robert E. Lee married a woman named Mary Ann Custis, and she was the great granddaughter of George Washington's wife, Martha. So he was married into a family that was connected all the way back to George Washington, the first president of the United States. Now, this is what it has to say about the Arlington plantation and the Custis slaves, which is what we're going to be discussing in this video. It says, in 1857, his father-in-law, George Washington Parke Custis, died, creating a serious crisis when Lee took on the burden of executing the will. Custis's estate encompassed vast land holdings and hundreds of slaves, but also massive debts. The will required people formerly enslaved by Custis to be emancipated by my executors in such manner as to my executors may seem most expedient and proper. The said emancipation to be accomplished in not exceeding 5 years from the time of my decease. The estate was in disarray, and the plantations had been poorly managed and were losing money. Lee tried to hire an overseer to handle the plantation in his absence, writing to his cousin, I wish to get an energetic, honest farmer who, while he being a considerate and kind to the Negroes, will be firm and make them do their duty. But Lee failed to find a man for the job and had to take a 2-year leave of absence from the army to run the plantation himself. So a descendant of George Washington and his wife, Martha Custis, was a man named George Washington Parke Custis. Okay. Now, this individual owned slaves, and he was he comes from a family of slave owners, the Custis family. So when he died, in his will, in his estate, he left the Arlington house and his slaves to Robert E. Lee and Robert E. Lee's wife, Martha Custis. Okay, and he had told George Washington Parke Custis had told the his slaves that when he died, he would emancipate them. They would go free, which several individuals did. The majority of people, when they died, they willed their slaves to their children, or they were sold off to pay off some type of a debt. But what he ended up doing is he told all of his slaves that they would be able to go free once he died. So this was the expectation of the slaves on the Arlington plantation. And so what eventually happened is when he died, he had not managed his money and his plantation correctly, and he was in debt. So he said that, okay, when I die, in order to pay off my debt and to settle my balances, the executors of my will and the executors of my estate can do what they want with my enslaved property. Okay, they can do what they want with my enslaved property to pay off the debt. but they only have 5 years to do it. After 5 years after my death, they have to let all of the slaves go free. Okay. Now, if they could pay off his debt in 2 years, then in 2 years, all of the slaves would go free. If they could pay off the debt in 1 year, then in 1 year, all of the slaves would go free. But there was a maximum time period of not exceeding 5 years after his death that he said that the enslaved individuals would have to go free. I see we got Brooklyn Zoo in the chat. Brooklyn Zoo says, Hotep King A, it's been a while, but we back in the building. Salute, salute, fam. Good to have you. No doubt, no doubt. Better late than never. Time is an illusion. You here now, you always been here. That's how I see it. Otto says, Mr. Daniels, salute to the chat. No doubt, no doubt. Salute to you, family. Thanks for tapping in. I really do appreciate it. I really do appreciate it. I hope everyone week is starting off great, and I hope everyone's weeks continues to be great. But anyway, so what ends up happening is they don't release the slaves. The slaves get upset. A lot of them start trying to escape. A lot of them start trying to run off to freedom, and they end up keeping a lot of them past the 5-year time period. And what happens is that causes a lot of animosity amongst the slaves, of course, because they were thinking that they were going to go free. And when they were supposed to go free, when George Washington Parke Custis died, they didn't go free. They were passed off to another owner. And this owner just so happens to be the famous Robert E. Lee. Okay, so are you with me so far? Now, this is from the official website dedicated to the Arlington House, the Robert E. Lee Memorial. And they have a section in there where they, quote unquote, tell the story of the enslaved people at the Arlington House. And they get into the archaeological excavations that have recently been done there. So building up to the archaeological excavations, I just wanted to paint the picture of who we're talking about, what we're talking about, the scenario of what we're talking about, because all of that is going to make sense when we get to the archaeological evidence of the hoodoo, because what the hoodoo is used for is in direct reference to what I just explained. The slaves supposed to go free. They weren't allowed to get their freedom, and they were passed off to someone else. So let's see what the official record tells us about these enslaved people at the Arlington House. And real quick, when you look at that picture that you have on the screen, Selena Gray and her daughters. Now, those were enslaved individuals, actual enslaved individuals at the Arlington House. And you're going to see as we move forward, the items associated with the hoodoo most likely came from that family right there. Okay. Powerful, 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 powerful image. It says, over the 60 years leading up to the Civil War, Arlington House was home to at least 100 enslaved African Americans who lived and labored on the estate. Enslaved people at Arlington House lived difficult lives of forced labor. However, they found small ways to resist, in addition to building families and close connections with each other. The National Park Service interprets the history of the Lee and Custis families and the stories of those enslaved by them, including the Shanks, Burke, Parks, and Gray families, to present a more complete story of life at Arlington House. And of course, no story is complete without the story of our ancestors. What we're doing here is we're bringing the story of our ancestors back to life. They say George Washington Parke Custis brought the first enslaved people to Arlington House in 1802. Most of them had been born at Mount Vernon, but were not owned by George Washington. Let's pause right there. Now, George Washington, the first president of the United States, was a slave owner. Let's just rip that band-aid off. If you didn't know that, he was a slave owner. And when they talk about Mount Vernon, the same Mount Vernon that's still in Virginia today, and I understand why it's a historical landmark. He's the first president. I can't just be too upset about that. It makes perfect sense. But Mount Vernon, whenever you hear them talk about Mount Vernon, where George Washington lived, you have to understand that Mount Vernon is a slave plantation. Let's make no mistake about it. They don't want to tell you that openly. They don't promote that too much. But Mount Vernon, where George Washington lived, is a slave plantation. And George Washington's father was a slave owner. And George Washington was a slave owner. And you see how they try to say that most of the slaves that were brought to the Arlington house had been born at Mount Vernon, but they were not owned by George Washington. That's not because George Washington didn't own slaves. That's because George Washington was married to a woman that was a Custis, and the Custis also owned slaves. So some of the slaves were George Washington slaves, and some of them he had bought, some of them he had inherited from his father, who was a slave owner, and some of them belonged to his wife via her bloodline in the Custis household, right? That's what they mean by that. But George Washington definitely was a slave owner, and Mount Vernon is 100% a slave plantation. It's in Virginia. Just think about it. It's in Virginia. When you think about Virginia during the time of slavery, that was a hotbed for slavery. That's where George Washington's Mount Vernon house is at. And almost every president makes a pilgrimage to Mount Vernon while they're in the White House. There's only a small handful who have not gone to Mount Vernon, the plantation. Anyway, they were part of the Custis estate. Look, there you go. They were part of the Custis estate from Martha Washington's first marriage. These enslaved people were held in trust for Martha's grandchildren on the event of her death. Basically, they were passing, like when you were a slave in perpetuity. That was one thing that made it so disgusting. You were a slave for life, and any children that you had were automatically born into slavery for life. And they would just be passed down from generation to generation to generation to generation. While George Washington specified in his will that the people he enslaved would be freed after Martha Washington's death, he did not have the authority to emancipate those who belonged to the Custis estate, as they would be transferred to Martha's children and grandchildren when she died. Now, yes, they will tell us that in George Washington's will, he wrote in there that his slaves were to be free. But he didn't say that when he died, his slaves were to be free. Oh, no. They were to continue serving his wife after his death. And then, okay, they could be given their freedom. But a lot of that was manipulated and changed after he died. But some of them that he was in control over, he didn't even outright own them. And his wife didn't outright own them. They would belong to the Custis estate. So they were forced to be handed down no matter what he thought and no matter what his wife thought. Anyway, they say for decades, those enslaved to the Custis and Washington families lived together at Mount Vernon, building families and bearing children. Because of this, Martha's death forced the rupture of many of the enslaved families at Mount Vernon. While those enslaved to George Washington were emancipated by Martha in 1801, when she died in 1802, those enslaved to the Custis estate went to the Custis heirs, namely Martha Washington's grandchildren, including Neely Custis Lewis at Woodland Plantation in Fairfax County, Virginia, Martha Park Custis Peter at Tudor Place in Washington, D.C., and George Washington Park Custis at Arlington House. So these slaves that we're talking about at the Arlington House, the Robert E. Lee Memorial, are directly connected to the individuals that were enslaved by George Washington, the first president, and his wife Martha, because they belong to the Custis estate. They're going to say enslaved people at Arlington House married, although these marriages were not legally recognized and had children. We got another comment. A Son the Great says, I'm new here. Well, welcome. You're more than welcome. Thank you for tapping in. I'm glad you clicked the link when you did it. If you enjoy the information, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so whenever I drop a new video, you're aware of the new video. But I appreciate having you in the building, family. So they also say, forced to build roads, cabins, work buildings, and Custis House. They also tilled the soil and grew the crops that provided wealth and sustenance for the Custis family. Did what many enslaved people do: took care of the building, took care of the home. They did all of the work. They did all of the cooking. They were the engine that made the car run. Many enslaved people had highly skilled jobs at Arlington. Charles Fanks oversaw the dining room. Daniel Dodson was the carriage driver, and Selena Gray was the housekeeper. Remember, they're telling us that Selena Gray was the housekeeper. This is Selena Gray and her daughters. She was the housekeeper. And keeping in line with the title of this video, remember, I'm saying it again because I want you to focus on this. The items associated with hoodoo that we're going to be seeing, the archaeological evidence, is most likely associated with her. Now, it's always hard to be 100% when you're doing archaeological research, but you can look at the most logical or the most probable conclusions that can be drawn from the evidence that you have available. So this is the Selena Gray, and we now know that she was the housekeeper. And unlike what many people would like us to believe, many of our ancestors, although they were enslaved, they had highly technical skills. They could do more than pick cotton. Pick cotton was that was just so basic. You know, they were the blacksmith. They could build houses. They could build roads. Okay, they could create things. They created so many inventions that were stolen from them, and the invention was given. The credit of the invention was given to the individual that owned them. They created medicines. I read one story where an outbreak of cholera was devastating the population. And an enslaved hoodoo worker had created a mixture. They call it magic, they call it potion, but it was medicine. Had created a medicine that could be applied to the eyes that healed the individuals that were going blind from the disease. When the particular slave owners saw this, they took the recipe, went to New York with the recipe, and made, bukus and bukus and bukus of money, and got the credit for coming up with this new medicinal treatment. But they didn't come up with the medicinal treatment. A hoodoo practitioner did, a root worker, a conjurer, what they call a conjurer. See, a lot of these things are science under a different name. It's medicine under a different name. But anyway, those enslaved at Arlington House found different ways to resist the institution of slavery. To resist slavery, enslaved men and women might break tools, take small items from the mansion, feign sickness, or work slowly. Not all of their resistance was aggressive. With quiet defiance, enslaved people established familiar bonds and practiced spiritual rituals. And we're going to get into those spiritual rituals. When George Washington Parke Custis died in 1857, he left his various plantations and land holdings at Arlington in Southern Virginia to his daughter, who was married to Robert E. Lee, and their sons. He also left his 4 granddaughters $10,000 each. At the end of his will, he stated that upon the legacies to my 4 granddaughters being paid, and my estates that are required to pay the said legacies being clear of debt, then I give freedom to my slaves. He stated that the emancipation should be accomplished within 5 years of his death. The executor of the will and Custis's son-in-law, Robert E. Lee, continued to enslave them for the full 5 years in order to work off the Custis family debt and pay out the legacies as stipulated in Custis's will. Some enslaved people defied Lee's orders or attempted to seek freedom. They felt they had been promised by the late Mr. Custis. In that regard, Lee wrote to his son that Custis had left me an unpleasant legacy. Wesley Norris, who was enslaved by Custis, recalled how Lee ordered the whipping of himself and 2 others who tried to free themselves from Arlington House by running north. So because they weren't free, as soon as Custis died, they were passed off to someone else. People, they started rebelling. They started trying to escape north. They started in minor ways refusing to work and refusing to work hard. And they turned to spiritual practices that we classify as hoodoo to rebel, fight back, and to try to get their freedom. They didn't know it, but the Civil War was about to kick off, and they were about to get their freedom anyway. Let's see. Do I want to read this? Let's just go down to this last paragraph. I kind of already covered a lot of that other information. They say a major rehabilitation effort completed in the summer of 2021 included artifact conservation, facilities restoration, and the installation of new interpretive exhibits that include multiple historical perspectives and are grounded in current research. New archaeological findings have shed light on past behaviors of enslaved individuals. Today, the National Park Service tells the whole story of its history might engender discomfort in ourselves, our colleagues, and our visitors, because it helps us to understand the complete story of our collective history and acknowledge those who have been too long ignored by the dominant narrative. The National Park Service acknowledges and recognizes the lives of those enslaved at Arlington House with respect, humanity, empathy, and agency. So this archaeological research was done only 3 years ago in 2021. Prior to that, they hadn't uncovered this evidence. That's why I'm saying it is an amazing time to be alive. And I'm sure after I'm dead and gone, and my children and grandchildren and great grandchildren are allowed to enjoy this earth, more research will be done, and they will uncover things that I don't even know anything about, that my eyes will never see. But what we're about to talk about now that I have painted the picture, I wanted to paint the picture for you guys. Now we're going to look at those archaeological findings, and we're going to consider what they mean in light of the evidence that has just been presented. The brother A-Son says, blessings to you, brother. Blessings to you as well. I'm going to pause for just a second to get a sip of my coffee, but you can see now we're at the section where they're talking about the archaeological discovery in the slave quarters. If you are a descendant of the enslaved people in America, this ties directly into your ancestors. Give me just a second, family. Okay, sorry about the dead air. The title says, Discovery of an Enslaved Family's Subfloor Storage Pit in Religious/Magical Shrine at the South Slave Quarters of Hoodoo. Discovery of an enslaved family subfloor storage pit in Religious/Magical Shrine at the South Slave Quarters of Arlington House. So hoodoo was still prevalent right at the time of the Civil War. Okay, Now, what is a subfloor pit? Before I read too far into this, for those of you who don't know, what they're calling a subfloor pit is a terminology that they're using when they excavate these old plantation sites. Now, remember, we're talking about people that were enslaved again, so they don't have access to a lot. Let's just be real. They have to use what they can get their hands on in a way that suits their purpose. Okay. So when they're talking about a sub storage pit or a sub floor storage pit, what they are describing is that within the slave quarters, they're seeing these more and more and more. What our ancestors would do, they would pick a particular location inside of that particular slave quarter, the dwelling that they lived in. Now, a lot of times the location that they chose held relevance, whether it was in the north corner, the south corner, the west, the east, the northeast, where this subfloor pit was located held significance. But what they would do is they would pick a specific location, they would dig down into the ground, and they would bury or store things that were important to them. Several reasons why they would do this is because a lot of times what they would find in these subfloor pits are things that an enslaved person is not supposed to have. Remember, they couldn't have anything that they wanted. So when they got their hands on something that they could possibly be punished for having or that could be taken from them, they would have to hide it. How would they hide it? By digging a hole in their slave quarters and burying it. Okay. And they would also use spiritual items. Like when we talk about hoodoo, we're talking about root work, we're talking about medicine, we're talking about things that are used as divination tools, things that are used as talismans, things that are used as amulets. Okay. And so with these spiritual items held great significance to the enslaved people who used them. And so let's say you had someone who was a root worker and they made potions that were meant to protect the enslaved or that were meant to harm. Like just say they wanted to put a curse on the overseer or a curse on the slave master. They would have specific bowls and specific jars and specific bottles where they would mix these concoctions together. And so these items were spiritual and ritualistic items. Now, they may not look like much to us, but again, they had to just use what they could get their hands on. And so these items that were used in the practice of their craft had to be hidden. Why? Because for one, in a lot of instances, it was illegal. They could be punished for trying to practice hoodoo, because hoodoo was a spiritual tradition that tied them back to the spirituality of Africa. And a lot of times they use this to try to, spiritually get themselves free, spiritually protect themselves, spiritually curse the slave owner. So they would bury these items, dig them out when they needed to use them, and then bury them again. Sometimes our ancestors were able to come across money. They found money buried inside of these subfloor storage pits. Okay. And so there are various items that individuals would use, but a subfloor storage pit is an area in the slave quarters that is dug out and used to house something or hide something or store something that held great significance to the person that was enslaved there. Okay. So look, the article says, in 2021, the National Park Service concluded an extensive rehabilitation at Arlington House, the Robert E. Lee Memorial. Philanthropist David Rubenstein provided funding for this major project. The rehabilitation improved visitor access and interpretation. It also restored the early 19th century mansion, dependencies, and immediate grounds. The buildings and land were once part of George Washington Parke Custis's plantation Built between 1802 to 1818, the site later became home to Custis's son-in-law, Robert E. Lee, the General of the Confederacy. The rehabilitation project saw work occur in the West Room of the South Dependency. This room had housed an enslaved family. Archaeological investigations took place in portions of the room years earlier. Archaeologists found artifacts representing the enslaved family's household goods. What were some of the household goods of an enslaved family? These included clothing buttons, ceramic dish pieces, food remains like animal bones, and even a toy porcelain doll hand. So they even had a toy porcelain doll. And those animal bones can be used to determine the diet of our ancestors while they were on those plantations. So there's a lot of information that we can get from this. This is what archaeology does. The construction crews working in the West Room during the rehabilitation made a more surprising discovery. They had removed a 20th century reconstructed brick flooring set in a sand bedding. While cleaning up the sand and modern field dirt under it, they dug a bit too deep in a spot. The workers uncovered 4 glass bottles clustered in historic period soils below this level. Park archaeologists intervened and arranged a work stoppage. After doing this, the archaeologists explored the unanticipated find. So this find was found in an area where enslaved people lived, and it had been covered up by more modern dirt, and there had been a 20th century reconstructed brick flooring set on top of it. So again, when you're doing archaeology, you have to dig down through several layers, and these several layers are they are related to different periods of time. Now, whenever they say, and forgive me if you already know this, but I just try to be as thorough as possible. When they say a 20th century reconstructed brick flooring set, 20th century is from 1900 to the year 2000. It's always counting up. Like if I say the 21st century, that's from 2000 to 2100. Okay, so we're talking about from 1900 to the year 2000. So anything that happened in the 1800s was covered up by this reconstructed brick flooring set. So they had to dig through that layer to see the layers that were associated with the time period of our ancestors' enslavement. That's how they know the deeper you dig, the older you go. That's generally how the archaeologists look at it. And so what you're seeing on your screen, this isn't an opinion. This is a picture of the actual 4 glass bottles that were discovered in this subfloor pit. Now we're going to get into them talking about how those bottles became associated with hoodoo and why. This is going to blow your mind. This is going to be interesting. Look, check this out. The archaeological investigations identified a subfloor storage pit near the fireplace hearth. This pit had contained the bottles which were most likely associated with the enslaved family of Selina and Thornton Gray. That's Selina Gray in the picture. That's Selina Gray and her 2 daughters. Now, remember, Selina Gray was the housekeeper, which is probably how she had access to get her hands on these glass bottles in the first place. Right? They occupied the West Room quarters in the mid-19th century. Mid-19th century is from 1850 to 1900. That time period is considered mid-19th century, 1850 to 1900. Okay, that's the general place chronologically wise they want your mind to go. Anyway, Analysis of the findings determined that the pit functioned as a type of magical or religious shrine. Now, this is not Wikipedia. This is not me. This is not somebody random. This is the archaeologists on the ground. The people who found this stuff, analyzed this stuff, talked to the experts about this, looked at the context of what was going on during that time period. They saying that they discovered a type of magical or religious shrine. Now, magic, hoodoo, conjure, this is hoodoo, family. This is hoodoo. I want to make sure you understand that. Now, look, it says it contained what likely was an enslaved people's spirit bundle of artifacts. The 4 bottles were part of this bundle and likely conjuring bottles. Now remember, in order to conjure, in order to do root work, in order to perform hoodoo, they would use herbs. They would use animal bones. They would use graveyard dirt. They would use roots. Okay, they would use things found in nature, and they would make mixtures, and they would make concoctions. Now, you can only make a mixture or a concoction inside of a container. Sometimes they use bowls, sometimes they use jars, sometimes they use bottles. If you look at any of the history about hoodoo, you're gonna understand this. They would even use cloth. Sometimes they would wrap these items up inside of some particular cloth. But they would always mix these things together. Okay, because remember, and it wasn't always about magic. Some of it was about medicine. Think about it. If when you think about doctors in the medical field or scientists trying to create new medicines, right? They have vials, they have test tubes, they have beakers. They have all of these glass jars with different substances in it, and they'll give you a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and they'll mix it together and test the results. Okay, but you're not gonna see these fancy items because these individuals were enslaved. Okay, remember that. So you're going to see them use what they can get their hands on. So these were conjuring bottles. They used these bottles to hold the tools of their trade. Look, the placement of a spirit bundle or conjure bottles as a part of a religious or magical shrine could serve various purposes. They could ward off evil. They could promote self-preservation. They could cast spells to harm others. They could host protective Ninkisi spirits or entrap malevolent entities. They could function as a talisman, an act of defiance to combat the harsh and dehumanizing realities of slavery, and to safeguard the future. Hoodoo is intimately tied to connecting with the spirit realm, the ancestors in the spirit realm, good entities in the spirit realm, evil entities in the spirit realm. They believed in spirituality wholehearted. Now, depending on what you wanted to use the hoodoo for, you could use it to protect yourself. You could use it to curse someone out, or not curse them out, or curse someone. You could use it to heal someone, right? You could use it to, like, an individual could get some graveyard dirt, and they could use that graveyard dirt and secure that graveyard dirt and keep that graveyard dirt as a means to connect the spirit of the individual buried beneath that grave to, keep that spirit close, so that that spirit can protect them from the evil things in the spirit realm. And they could also be used if there was like a bad spirit, to trap that evil spirit inside of this conjuring bottle. This bottle may have the spirit to contain the evil force. This is not an exact analogy, but have you guys ever seen Ghostbusters? And with Ghostbusters, they'll be going out and they'll be trying to catch the ghost. They'll throw this contraption out that'll open up, and it'll capture the ghost, and it'll pull them inside of this like containment unit. right? Or if you're watching a movie and they'll be trying to cast out an evil spirit, and they're like, okay, we got to get the evil spirit out of this person and cast that spirit inside of this container to hold them. Okay, there's always been an understanding of being able to contain spirits, right? Even when you think about a genie, genies come from the Islamic understanding of a jinn. The devil himself is a jinn, supposedly made of fire and smoke. That's why when you see things like Aladdin, they find a lamp, right? They find the lamp, they rub the lamp, and boom, out pops a genie, which is a genie is a jinn, a spirit entity. And the genie is always like, oh, I've been trapped in here for 1,000 years. Well, who trapped the genie inside of this thing? And and who gave them the concept of being able to trap a jinn inside of a lamp? Okay, so this idea of trapping spirits is replete throughout ancient history. And this idea of being able to commune with good spirits and bring good spirits into your area to help protect you. That's normal when you talk about hoodoo, when you're talking about spirituality, when you're talking about almost all religions. Okay, look, they go on to say subfloor storage pits are a feature often found in dwellings of enslaved people. So they're not drawing their conclusions based off one finding. Remember, they have excavated several plantations. You may not be aware of these excavations, but they've been done, and they are compiling information, and it's showing them a pattern. That's how they know, okay, when we see this, we now know what this is. And they're using things like the slave narratives that I always present to you guys to get further understanding. Because I did a video once where I showed you several slave narratives, aka the oral histories of our ancestors, talking about subfloor pits. So we have eyewitness accounts of subfloor pits, we have archaeological evidence of subfloor pits, so we quite know for certain what they were used for. Anyway, archaeologists have explained these features in the past as serving various purposes. These include everything from utilitarian to sacred purposes. Enslaved people may have used them as food storage pits or for storage of personal items. The pits may have been hiding places for stolen goods. They may have functioned as religious or magical shrine-like chambers. Again, our ancestors used these subfloor pits for a multiplicity of different reasons. It makes perfect sense that an individual that was enslaved, who was only allowed a particular small rations that was supposed to last them for a week, if they got their hands on more food some type of way, they would want to keep that hidden because they could be punished for having it. It could be taken from them. And all of the enslaved people didn't get along. Someone else might try to steal it from them. They all didn't get along with one another. Most of the time, if they were on the same plantation, they got along, but it would still be just like it is today. They go on to say the unusual find of the 4 bottles and pit hints that there were likely West African religious connections and creolized hoodoo root work, religious folk magic customs at Arlington. Bam. Now we have the official article, the official archaeologists, the official people on the ground directly connecting this to hoodoo, not just me. I didn't just put hoodoo in the title. Okay. I'm not just going to Wikipedia, although I love Wikipedia, but sometimes it's wrong. But this is the people on the ground doing the archaeological research. They telling you, hey, look, this is most likely a connection to hoodoo. What's hoodoo? Is West African religious practices brought over to the plantation, mixed in with Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and used and that were used to create a entirely new, with old roots, but a new religious or spiritual system. Now, some people find it hard to understand why I call it a new system if it's connected to old practices. Listen to me good. Every single religion on the planet is tied to something older than it. The easiest example I can give is we all understand Islam is its own religion, but there would be no Islam without Christianity, without Judaism. Christianity is its own thing, but there would be no Christianity without Judaism. Judaism is its own thing, but there would be no Judaism without the Babylonian religious tradition, the Sumerian religious tradition, the Egyptian religious tradition. And even with Egypt, even with the Egyptian religion, you can find evidence of those Neteru prior to when Norma formed the country of Kemet that we're calling Egypt. So everything ties back to something older than it. But when it takes on a new form, a new shape to serve a new purpose in a new area, we have to identify it as something new, and we give it a new name. So hoodoo was created by our ancestors on the slave plantation. I don't care what anybody says. Yes, it's tied to things older than it, but everything is tied to something older than it. Let me get off my soapbox. It also demonstrates that enslaved people resisted their bondage and persevered for freedom. Most notable about the four intact glass bottles discovered was that all were pointing northward. The location of the pit and the positioning of the bottles within it are highly suggestive of a shrine with magical or religious powers. All four bottles were placed side by side with their openings pointed northward as if toward freedom. Now remember, the time period that we are discussing, yes, we're getting close to the Civil War, but these individuals, the Gray family, were told that they were going to get their freedom when George Washington Parke Custis died. But when George Washington Parke Custis died, he willed this family and many others to Robert E. Lee and Robert E. Lee's wife, Mary Custis. Okay, and so the historical record reflects that this created a lot of discontent amongst the enslaved people at Arlington. Many of them tried to escape to the north. They were like, hell no, we're supposed to be free. We ain't going for it. Stop playing with me. They literally tried to escape to the north. There's a first-hand account of one man who said he tried to escape north because of this foolishness. He was caught, brought back, and Robert E. Lee himself had him whooped. And in the archaeological record, Robert E. Lee talks about the rebellion of these enslaved people because of what happened. So now we're seeing that part of the rebellion, as it always was with our people, was a spiritual thing. It's just like someone saying, if you you're going through hard times and you just start praying. You pray that God would help you. You pray that God would alleviate your suffering. Well, individuals who practiced hoodoo, they would do something like get their conjure bottles, get their tools that they use in their root and their religious customs, and they would place them in a circular pit that is a shrine, because they cannot have a shrine out in the open. They would be whipped. Okay, so they would bury it, but they would most likely say some ritualistic words over it, perform some type of ceremony, place these 4 glass bottles and have all of these 4 bottles with the openings facing north, because they are trying to bring some spiritual energy and spiritual power to help them get free, right? They always used hoodoo to try to help them get free. Even when they were about to revolt, a lot of times before our ancestors revolted, they would go to the hoodoo root worker. And the hoodoo root worker would give them roots to put on their persons to protect them. They would make powder out of graveyard dirt and other items, and they would put these powders on their bodies before they went out to fight. And when some of our ancestors would flee on the Underground Railroad, the hoodoo root worker would put powders and mixtures on their feet to help them, move fast, evade the dogs, not let the dogs catch their scent. So hoodoo is always associated with people, our people, when they are struggling to get free. So we see these 4 bottles placed in this subfloor pit, these conjure bottles, and all of them are facing north. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Look, the pit was also located to the north and east of the fire hearth. This could be symbolic. Now they have to talk like that because they can't say 100% certainty, but based on the facts available, we can make a damn good hypothesis, educated guess about what's going on. This could be symbolic as east pointed toward a new day sunrise or toward home in Africa. Now, I don't think it was pointing home toward Africa because we know a lot of our ancestors, they didn't want to go back to Africa. It just is what it is. They wanted full rights. They wanted to be free here. They wanted to be free here. This is where they felt like they were born. They wanted to stay here. They just wanted to be treated right. And now some of them wanted to go back home to Africa, and some of them did. That's why when the American Colonization Society created the colony of Liberia in West Africa, thousands of our ancestors, they went back. But as a whole, I'm saying we're talking about in the millions. Just reality is our ancestors didn't want to go to Africa. I've read some of the stories. They wanted to stay here. They just wanted to be treated right. Okay. Look, they go on to say these cardinal directions suggest important spiritual imagery in the enslaved people's lives. They could also have ties to the eastern quadrant corresponding to birth and life of the West African Bakongo cosmogram. The cosmogram depicts the relationship between the spiritual and physical worlds and the life cycle. Now, whenever you're talking about hoodoo, and whenever you're talking about these archaeological excavations, one thing that is always going to come up is the Bakongo cosmogram. Now, if you want to understand how our ancestors on the plantations who practiced hoodoo viewed life, the afterlife, death, what were their conceptions on that, you have to look at the Bakongo cosmogram. Now, it's a reason these archaeologists are bringing up the Bakongo cosmogram, because the Bakongo cosmogram has been found carved into archaeological artifacts that were found on plantations. So it's like, we actually have proof of these things now. Now, before I finish this, I just want to explain real quick. Look, they say that these cardinal directions suggest important spiritual imagery in the enslaved people's lives. This particular subfloor pit was placed in the northeast of the slave quarters, and the bottles were facing north. We know that the bottles were facing north because they were like summoning freedom. They were invoking freedom, getting to the north, getting to free. Now, the location of the subfloor pit itself was in the northeast. What does the northeast represent? They say they could also have ties to the northeastern quadrant corresponding to birth and life of the West African Bakongo cosmogram. What is the Bakongo cosmogram? This is the Bakongo cosmogram. Now, what I'm showing you on the right is an actual artifact that they found not at the Arlington house, okay, but at another archaeological site of a plantation. They found some pottery, multiple pieces of pottery that had the Bakongo cosmogram. You see that cross, the image on your right, you see that cross carved into the center of that circle. That circle with that cross, when our ancestors did that, they were invoking what's known as the Bakongo cosmogram. Bakongo is a reference to the West Central African Bakongo religion. Remember, hoodoo is mixed with West and Central African religion. Okay, and so the Bakongo cosmogram has 4 cardinal points. that are in essence related to the four cardinal points on a compass: north, south, east, west. Now, when you look at the image on your left, the Congo cosmogram, we're going to do this real quick. To the on the right, the black circle that would be associated with the east, okay, that represents the moment of birth. And it also represents the sunrise, the sun rising in the east. Okay. These 4 points also correspond to the sun's movement, and the sun's movement corresponds to the journey that your spirit takes. So that black circle to the right represents the east. It represents the rising sun, and it represents the birth of the individual. When you come through the birth canal and you take your first breath of air on this side of the womb, you're born. Just like when the sun peaks over the horizon, the head crowning through the birth canal. Okay, and so you see from there, the arrow is going towards the red circle that would be associated with the north. Okay, that represents the sun at its highest point in the sky, noonday. Okay, and it also represents the point when an individual that has been born reaches maturity. Okay, if it was associated with American ideology today, we would probably associate it with the age of around like 18. Oh, when you're 18, you become a man, you become a woman, you become an adult, something like that. But that corresponds to when the child matures into an adult, and it corresponds with the north, and it corresponds with the sun at the highest point in the sky. That's when you mature. That's when the sun matures on its journey. Now, from there, you see the arrow going towards the left, and it's going to a white circle, which represents the west. Okay. Now, that west represents the sunset. That is when the sun is setting. It's going over the horizon in the west. The sun is setting, and it represents when the adult dies. The sun sets, your spirit sets, dies. The sun goes away. You go away from this physical realm. But just like we know the sun is going to come back, it's not really gone. You are not really gone. That's how our ancestors seen it. So when you see from the west, that white circle, there's an arrow going towards the bottom, going towards that yellow circle. That represents the south. Now that's the journey that the dead spirit is taking. You are right there. You are in the realm of the ancestors. Okay, that's death. That's why you are dead. And that represents with the south. Okay, and it represents the moment, I guess, when the sun is halfway between setting and rising. Now, at the moment of conception, that's what that south point represents. When you begin to be born again, it is an idea of reincarnation. That is when the sun begins to be born again. Not yet born again because it hasn't risen over the horizon in the east. Just like you, at the moment of conception, you have not been born again, right? Your body still has to be formed. This fleshly container for your spirit has to be created. You need the lungs, the eyes, the teeth, the arms, the legs, the ribs, the hand. You need all of that to be created in the womb. And when you're finally ready, you're born. And so from that yellow, we see the arrow going towards the black circle again. And they're calling that conception. That's the individual, the body being created, the spirit coming back into a new body, about to be born after 9 months. And that's the sun coming around, about to be born again, or about to come over the horizon again. Okay. Now, that's why they say that the hoodoo items that we're talking about, the 4 bottles, were found in the northeast corner. That would be symbolizing right after that new birth, from new birth to maturity, new birth to maturity. Now, the symbolism behind that, obviously, and in full transparency, it's obvious, is up for interpretation. Now, we do know that the 4 bottles were facing north, talking about freedom. It could be talking about a new life in general, a new life, as in a new life without being a slave, but a new life in freedom. That could be what they were trying to invoke, that they want a new life. They want to be, quote unquote, born again, not in slavery, but in freedom, in a free state. They were supposed to be free, but these individuals have kept them enslaved. Even after George Washington Parke Custis died, damn, we still enslaved. Will this go on for? And it could also be a idea tied to that, okay, even if I have to die a slave, right? Because I don't know if they'll ever let me go. If I die a slave, they could just be invoking that, when I'm born again, when I resurrect, because they believed in resurrection. When I'm born again, may I be born again in new life as a free person, because it's pointing north towards freedom. In my next life, I don't want to be a slave again. So it's so much power in the symbolism of them burying those 4 bottles used to conjure in the northeast quadrant of the house, and having all of them pointing north. We see that it's all about freedom. It's all about a new beginning. It's all about a new start. And it's all about leaving this past of slavery behind. And that goes hand in hand with the history of what's going on at the Arlington house. So they go on to say, events of the mid-19th century. Now remember, the 19th century, 1850 to 1900. Events of the mid-19th century proved to be very traumatic and uncertain for the enslaved people at Arlington. Uncertain. They didn't know what was going to happen. So that lends credibility to the interpretation that I'm describing about the positioning of these conjure bottles. This was the period when Selena and Thornton Gray and their family lived in the South Dependency. Among those events was the death of George Washington Parke Custis. Following his death, there was confusion and uncertainty whether his will freed the enslaved people. Though some believed they were to be immediately freed, the will actually delayed freedom for a maximum of 5 years. This realization resulted in an increase of escape attempts. Families were separated when enslaved people were hired out to other plantations. In 1861, the outbreak of the Civil War led to even more uncertainty. Would occupying Union soldiers be sympathetic to the enslaved people's plight? Questions about their enslavement and whether they would be free may have motivated the Grays to engage the supernatural. They may have viewed this as a way to resist bondage and safeguard their future. The National Park Service prepared a technical report that documents the archaeological finding. It includes context around the historical events. It also offers potential explanations for the creation of the subfloor storage pit. So what we're looking at here is an actual family of enslaved ancestors who used hoodoo. And we see them using hoodoo in one of the most purest ways, trying to secure their freedom in either this life or the next. Now, when we're looking at this picture, we can actually imagine the woman on the right that's looking back at us. We can imagine her using these conjure bottles for various means, to protect her family, to ward off evil spirits, to invoke the protection of helpful spirits, to create concoctions to heal her babies when her babies were sick, to assist individuals that were talking about escaping to freedom. Because whenever someone talked about escaping, they would go see the root worker, they would go see the conjure woman, they would go see the conjure man. So it's likely that many of those individuals who tried to escape to freedom during this uncertain time went to the woman on your screen, Selena Gray, the housekeeper, to ask for her help. And when events in her life seemed to be bigger than what she could handle physically, because she couldn't just escape to the north, she couldn't just leave her babies behind, and she couldn't take her babies with her. So she leaned on her spirituality being hoodoo. And so she took these four glass bottles that she had using countless times before, to mix herbs, mix roots, mix graveyard dirt, make concoctions that were meant to heal, make concoctions that were meant to protect, make concoctions that were possibly meant to harm bad, mean, cruel overseers. She dug a pit in the northeast corner of her home that was associated with new birth, new life, a new reality. And she lovingly and gently and ritualistically made them all face north, the place of north being the place that our ancestors associated with freedom, crying out for freedom, crying out for a new life, not only for her, but for her babies and her babies' babies after her. And had it not been for these new archaeological excavations that are being done, we never would have known this woman's story. But we're looking at an actual hoodoo worker, and we have seen the tools of her trade, and we know how she used those tools, and we know why, and we know the story of the individual that enslaved her. Powerful, powerful, powerful information. So this video has been archaeological evidence of hoodoo, Robert E. Lee Memorial, Arlington House. Now, I am sure the more archaeological excavations that are done, the more information will come out. The more information that comes out, the more we will learn, the more we will know. Okay. And I'm just happy about that fact. So when you guys see me on here and I'm talking about hoodoo, I'm talking about much more than magic. Okay, I'm talking about real people. I'm talking about real people and their stories, real people and their struggles, real people in their fight for freedom. It isn't always glamorous, and it isn't always, oh, somebody put a spell on somebody to hurt them. No, sometimes they used hoodoo, simply to get free. So as I wrap this up, I want to just thank everybody for tapping in, everybody that came in the building. I appreciate you. I appreciate the support. I appreciate the love. I hope you guys heard something during this live stream that you never heard before. I hope you are a little more interested in the history of your ancestors. And if you are in the right place. This is the channel for you. I go into more of this history than any other channel that I've seen on YouTube. So as I sign out, as always, may your name, family, may your name live on forever, and may your memory never die. Till next time, Hotep, Shalom, Ashe, peace. I'm out.